first of, I think, many. We have another one right here who's in the neighborhood, so that's good. So my name is Jeffreen Hayes. I'm Executive Director of Threewalls. Thank you for coming out in this horrible weather and on a night where there's a lot going on. Want to introduce Elysia and give you a little background on Artadia and the Art and Dialogue program. So Art and Dialogue is a national program designed to expand support for Artadia's growing network of awardees. Artadia currently supports over 300 awardees working in a diverse array of disciplines in 7 cities across the country. Developed through in-depth research of artists' needs, Art and Dialogue bridges connections between visual artists, curators, and diverse publics in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco through a series of studio visits, public programs, and online engagement. Artadia is a national nonprofit organization that supports visual artists with unrestricted merit-based awards and fosters connections to a network of opportunities. They recognize artistic excellence in cities throughout the United States and introduce local communities to the international art conversation. In the past 15 years, Artadia has awarded over $3 million to more than 300 artists throughout its participating award cities. Now, the introduction of Elysia Reeder. As Executive Director of MOCAD, is that how you?
MOCAD, yep.
MOCAD. Elysia Reeder plays an essential role in establishing the vision, goals, and strategic plans for the organization. Fulfilling MOCAD's mission through close collaboration with key stakeholders, Reeder tirelessly works to sustain the museum and to secure its permanent future in Detroit for generations to come. Elysia joined MOCAD as Executive Director in April 2013. She is the former founding director of Contemporary Art Museum, but I've also seen the Contemporary Art and Design Museum?
Yep.
Okay, in Raleigh, and served in leadership positions at MCA Chicago, Milwaukee Art Museum, and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Having curated over 40 exhibitions, most recently Robert Pruitt's Obama paintings and Jose Lerma's La Bella Crisis exhibitions at MOCAD, Reeder will curate the largest exhibition of Sanford Bigger's career in fall 2016. Elysia holds 2 master's degrees from MSU, was named a 2008 Getty Museum Leadership Fellow, and attended Yale School of Management and Antioch College. Welcome, Elysia.
Thanks for having me. So great. Thanks. I'm going to just talk a little bit about Detroit. I'm going to talk about what's happening there, and I'm going to talk a lot about MOCAD. I just pulled these recent headlines about Detroit because Detroit has captured the minds and some hearts, but mostly minds of everyone across the globe. So it's an international city, and it makes it exciting when you have French, German tourists come through. It's a fantastic place, but it's a complicated place. Here's the facade of MOCAD. It's a former auto dealership, and so it's right on Woodward. It's in the heart of the cultural corridor, right down the street from the Detroit Institute of Arts. It got a light renovation when it opened 10 years ago, meaning that it got these crazy overhead heaters and some lights and some bathrooms, but it is raw. It's very raw. And when I first got here to MOCAD about 3 years ago, I was like, where do we own the building? What's the deal? And they're like, well, yeah, we have it. We have a deal. And I'm like, let's get the deed. You got to get site control. And so we got the building donated, and then we're starting to sort of do more renovation and fix it up. But it was built in 1905 by Albert Kahn. Albert Kahn was an architect that worked mostly for Henry Ford. And we love it. It's near and dear. This was, the front of it gets a lot of graffiti by invite, and this was the mural that we had by Next. This was a graffiti artist that passed away, and these artists approached us and they said they wanted to do something to commemorate their artist that passed, their friend and artist that passed away. So I was like, paint the front of the building, paint the sides, but I will change it eventually. And so then when we changed it to this. It was an Andrew Quo mural. And you see all the construction in front, and it's because they're building light rail down all of Woodward. And Woodward hasn't had a rehab in like 85 years. So they're digging it up and they're finding all kinds of things, but they're also taking the opportunity to lay fiber optic cable. But they're also finding lots of like clay pipes and other railroads. So it's taking a little bit of time. So it's getting a whole new facelift, which is much needed. And then the crazy thing about this is that it's mostly privately funded. This is a little picture of Andrew and a better picture of the mural. So we do a lot with the front of our building. It's not very precious. At some point in the 1980s, it had like this Italian restaurant facade put on it. And so I don't really have the money to go and sort of take it back to the original facade. So my attitude is layer some more paint on it, change it every year. It's not precious in any kind of way. The big project that was coming online when I came to MoCA was the Mike Kelly Mobile Homestead. It was a very exciting project, only because it really didn't have its place yet. It was a very difficult project, just like a lot of Mike Kelly artwork is, and it made it a little bit more complicated because he recently passed away. It was late, and they had a big opening date already set, and so we had to work fast, and we had to sort of put this together with a program, and it gets a little complicated because if you'll imagine, the front of it pulls away, and the front of it is the mobile part, and that was already conceived and done and in storage. And then we were actually building the house that it anchored onto. So this mobile homestead can detach from its home base, and we took it to the Geffen to be part of the retrospective. We took it around and gave away books, and we parked it in front of closed libraries in Detroit, because that's a city that struggles with its resources, and we handed out books, and it acted as sort of a lending library for its first year. Here's a picture of it attached to its home base. So it looks like a replica of his home in Westland, Michigan, exact replica. And actually the office that our curator of education office is in is his bedroom. But it's about 1,500 square foot, and it's actually built to the T, except you'll notice a big sort of hitch on the outside, which enables it to be pulled away. And then the front sidewalk has a big hatch, and so it goes 40 feet deep, and it's a series of rooms and ladders, and so there's a basement and a sub-basement, and this was all designed as Mike Kelly's private space where he was intending to go to do thinking, and it's almost like physical sculpture when you go down there. So it's a series of ladders and little rooms with different heights, and it's kind of like you have to climb through these rooms with ladders. And he wrote a little bit about it, and he was saying, well, it's kind of like when you have to travel through like the deep gray matter in your mind to get to your subconscious. It's a very physical form of having a basement and a sub-basement. And then also you see the garage that has a garage. And then one of the ideas is that he imagined bands playing in the garage. And he's like, oh, you can be in a garage band, and you can go in the basement and be an underground artist. So he had kind of a sense of humor to all of this. And when we opened it, Jim Shaw came and played, and he comes back. Every Sunday we have jam sessions in the garage, and anyone from the community to come and jam. And sometimes they're really good, and sometimes, it's one person with a sitar, and you wonder, hi, how are you? And this is one of the ways, people always ask me, like, how did you raise $1.5 million for a replica of Mike Kelly's childhood home? And we had Art Angel on the project, which Mike Kelly got on board. MoCA did not do that, but Mike Kelly went to London and got them on board, and they donated about $1 million. And then what you're looking at is these aluminum sculptures. They're additions that he made, and we sold these. Gagosian sold these, and now Hauser and Wirth sells them, and as they sell, they get more expensive. But you can see the basement and the sub-basement and the house, and he calls these chandeliers, and they're made out of aluminum. And there's 15 of them, and all of the proceeds go to MoCA to maintain our mobile homestead, and Hauser and Wirth really appreciates when we don't give any commission, because we have to take it all because we're a not-for-profit. But they've been really popular. So this is kind of the crazy part. The upstairs is where we do all of our community programs. And so we have the teen council meet there. We have a quilting society that meets there, and I think you see a picture of the quilters. And that silver band that you see in the picture is how the mobile homestead connects, because there's a disconnect that pulls away. And it's incredible. These are master quilters that were working in a basement, so they're really happy to be someplace where there's natural light. But this is not an entry-level quilting bee. This is serious. And I didn't know when I started working with quilters is that there's hand stitchers and there's different patterns, and the world of quilting is a world unto itself with different worlds, and everyone is very serious about their quilting. But so they come every Sunday and they bring their things and they trade scraps and they help each other, and they camp out all day. They're there at 10 a.m. and they leave at 5 p.m. This is our library mission. We have to do an annual, so we work in partnership with the Mike Kelly Foundation for the Arts. And so for the next 5 years, we're tied together to work on this as one. And so we have to outline everything with goals and objectives and budgets, and we have to get everyone on board. They have a board, we have a board, it's all these boards, it's all these people. And so our first project was that we drove around and we handed out these books. This is Ivan. He was our sitar guy that came every Sunday, so we invited him to come out. We're at Eastern Market. We're giving out books. And I think you can see the Teen Council. We went to Garfield Park where they had a library, but it closed. And then we went to the south part of Detroit by Boblo Island docks. Maybe some of you went to Boblo Island, an amusement park. And we dropped off books there. But we do a lot of exhibitions in there, so it's all community driven. We take a lot of proposals from the community. And this is the Fifth Estate. So Fifth Estate is a 50-year-old alternative press. They're real funny guys. They had me at, I was like, I don't know, alternative press, what are you guys talking about? Show me something. And they opened it up and it said, Jesus cancels Easter. And it was an ad, you know. And so I was like, you guys got to do a show. And this is them hanging out by their cast corridor offices, and so they're really cool guys. And they kept all of this ephemera. And so they had John Sinclair. John Sinclair was a poet that went to jail for having a joint. They had all this like F-bomb, F-authority. So it was kind of like this political sort of depository for all this ephemera. And we laid it all out, and we covered the walls in it, and it was really groovy. And I think there's people behind at the opening. We had poetry readings with John Sinclair. Lenny Sinclair is like the photography to rock and roll. They're no longer together, so we had to keep them apart. And there's people smoking pot in the back of the homestead. I mean, it seemed really sort of radical for them. They all got together. And then we kind of flip around, and we do like studio projects. So we invited this group called Thing Thing. I met them in our cafe, and because we have a cafe at the museum, and they're like, we were collecting plastic, and because there's no recycling program in Detroit, so they would collect this plastic, shred it down, and they would make tables, lawn chairs, coasters, anything. They could just melt it down, and they had built this homemade oven, which looked like crazy, and they had built this grinder, and it was these U of M graduates from the School of Architecture, and they were literally cleaning up the streets of Detroit because they're collecting all this really cool plastic, grinding it up and melting it down. And so we invited them to be in residence, and so they built out the garage, and really they just made all kinds of like really great stuff. And it's just been pretty rewarding to see that kind of happen in the last 3 years, and people actually propose things to us. And then, of course, we get a lot of funding from, we don't get a lot, but we get $50,000 a year from the Rauschenberg Foundation. That leveled off, and now we get $50,000 a year from the Mike Kelly Foundation for the Arts. And so, you know, we have a little bit of funding to work with these community groups and artists. But Detroit is rich, and so I want everyone to visit. Has anyone been to Detroit? Is anyone from there? Okay, great. So there's some Detroiters, and so this is Dobble's. It's actually Dobble's African Bee Museum. The museum part is cut off, and so he's someone. And this is kind of there's a few sites like this in Detroit where people will cover homes or they would deconstruct homes because real estate became very inexpensive, and so you could actually treat it as an art thesis project or an art project. So Dobbles was just kind of covering his house and like doing this, and he was kind of just working under the radar. No one really cared. And then he kind of went out, and so he started working in his backyard. But he has a really nice line to him. And then someone came along and said, you should really apply for a Kresge. And Kresge gives out $10,000, $25,000 grants every single year. And sometimes it's to visual arts, sometimes it's to filmmakers, or sometimes it's to music. And so it kind of cycles. And I think there's a residency requirement. But this really keeps people living and working in Detroit. But this guy got a Kresge, and he's really well deserved. And it's just amazing, like his whole hand. And it keeps changing. So you can go back once and you can see what he's done. But I'm sure maybe not in the winter, but in the summer and the spring, he's out there changing it even more. And then we have like the Powerhouse Productions. This is a group of people who worked in Hamtramck, and they bought lots of different $500 houses. And they made one for community groups. This one is called the Playhouse. For some reason, my like labels, they looked good one on my computer, but they don't look good here. The Playhouse, the front of it is actually a stage where they do sort of alternative theater, and people kind of come from the neighborhood. And Hamtramck is the neighborhood I grew up in now. It was mostly Polish. It still had 3 Polish newspapers when I left in the 5th grade, but now it's completely changed, and now they call it Banglatown. So there's a large Bangladeshi community that moved in, and then there's a lot of artists that moved in that have these sort of interventions into the neighborhood. Here's a map of the Powerhouse Productions, because they started out with one house and they kept on collecting and adding, and so they're sort of like building their own sort of art utopia community, which is really interesting. And this is the Jar House, which is another sort of place where you can get information, you can exchange with residents, you can have books, there's a visual archive, there's technology, there's Wi-Fi. Getting Wi-Fi in Detroit now is maybe easier, but pre-bankruptcy, it was a little difficult. And so if you had a place that had Wi-Fi, you had friends. I'll just put it that way. And this is the outside of one of their houses. And this is the office and library project. And this is a gathering place. And you can't tell because this picture is during the day. But what they did is they put in fluorescent tubes on the side of their house, which faces the street, because none of the street lights work. And they kind of work now, but not really. And so it's largely dark, so that it's very low light. And so what they did is that they inserted beams of light or fluorescent tubes inside the house, and it illuminated the sidewalk there. So people had lots of different ways of doing lighting in Detroit because it was dark. It was dark. And then there's like young kids doing crazy things like opening the Bahamas by Neil in this huge industrial warehouse space. And this is Sean and Lauren Taylor, who's a Chicago artist, just graduated from the School of the Art Institute, and Ken Gagami, who did a deer hoof, and then Keith. And Keith did a really very radical project, which I don't know if I have a picture of it. I think it was so radical. So what he does is he just paints older men like they have black running shorts, and then they wear a white t-shirt, and you slowly realize as you're in the gallery that this person doesn't have actual pants on, but it's paint. And then you realize that it's a small room and they're just on their phone and they're not visiting the art, but they are the art. So you have this very slow realization. And depending on the day, the paint job is better and worse. And then it gets great because he'll post all of, the Bahamas want their address back. And so they keep writing them. I keep writing Sean, like, hey, we want to do it by Neil. Can we have that? Can we have that address? And he won't sell it to them, or he won't give it to them. So he just keeps posting all the notices he gets from the cultural government. There's quite a few interesting artists, like Scott Hocking. I don't know if anyone's familiar. He's shown widely, but he is someone that makes his work from the ruins of Detroit. And this is his egg picture that was in Time magazine. I think it was probably about 2012, and this is in the train station, and there's this great story that's in Time magazine where the reporter was walking around ruins. That's a very tourist Detroit thing to do, is to kind of go urban dwelling. And so a Time magazine person was walking around the train station, and all of a sudden he turned the corner and said, oh shit, because he saw this like beautiful form in the train station. And so it made like the centerfold about, and this was sort of like the story that broke many stories about Detroit, because all of a sudden everyone realized that Detroit was in ruins, and it's a city that's just been marred by decades of lack of social mobility. And it's not just like since the 80s, it's like decades and decades. And so this is an artist that truly makes his practice out of things that he finds in Detroit. And he's someone that's been living there since the 80s, working for an incredible gallery named the Suzanne Hillbilly Gallery. He was the preparator. And so he was just, that's great. He did a show there. But he's been bringing bits and parts of Detroit around the world for his shows. But then that is his practice, is all of this sort of artifact from Detroit. And then there's the Heidelberg Project, which really kind of started out as one person, Terry Garten, with like a vision. Hey, there's abandoned houses. I want to make it friendly. I'm tired of looking at ugly things. And so he just started decorating with records or dots or stuffed animals. And then it kind of like turned into this quasi-illegal sculpture park. And then the city started cracking down and saying, well, do you own these houses? And he's like, no, but who does? I'd like to buy them. We don't know who owns them. Because the city records are very difficult and antiquated. And it's not just like a street with like 3 or 4 houses. It is blocks that he has sort of taken with this Heidelberg Project. And then it's called Heidelberg Project because it's on Heidelberg Street. And you'll drive and drive and drive. You'll see nothing. And all of a sudden you'll see like sort of like these like quasi sort of like decorated houses. And some people live there, some people don't. Some people don't like the traffic. Some people enjoy the traffic. And it's a lot of volunteers that keep this up and add to it. But then in about the last year and a half, one of the volunteers was a youth at risk and started burning down the Heidelberg Project. And so that turned into like this whole other sort of like conversation. And then Tyree's like, what do I do? What's my practice post Heidelberg? And he's an artist in his own interesting way. And so these projects get started, and then the city keeps trying to kick them out. But then it's also one of the main reasons why people travel to Detroit, so it's a kind of a contentious project. But there's a lot of projects like that. Like Dobbles is one, Heidelberg. There's quite a few urban farms where sort of things have been left, and then people come and they're like, oh, this is a community garden. I'm going to do my own garden. But I don't know who lives here. I don't know who owns it. And so it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on there. And then in recent months, well, maybe a year, Robert Elms bought, I think, 12 buildings. He's a group from Brooklyn called Galapagos, which I'd never heard of. I've been going to New York all the time for arts, and I've never heard of this not-for-profit, but he was in Dumbo, and the rents got raised, and so he came to Detroit and bought 12 buildings, mostly on auction, for very inexpensive. And so he had this idea where he was going to sort of bring the arts not-for-profit to Detroit and start that. And the buildings he bought were in Highland Park, and just north of Detroit, he bought big buildings. I mean, some of the buildings he bought are just like 100,000 square feet. They're old schools, they're old hospitals, old churches. It sounds really exciting. And so part of his business plan is that he was going to sell off some of the cheaper buildings, and that was going to create funds then to reinvest into some of the buildings he had actionable plans for. Well, when he went to go do this, the people of Detroit found out that he put his building up for sale for 14 times the original purchase price, and they literally burnt it down. So that's what I mean. Like, Detroit is very political, and so if you're going to leave Brooklyn and try to do the same thing in Detroit, you have to be very smart about it. So he's got a long way to go, I would say. I don't know. He's a very nice guy, and I felt bad about that one. So then there's like exciting things that happen. I was just saying there's this illegal club called Tires, and it's right across the street from where I have this other sort of satellite building, and I found it only because it's so loud. The bass was making the alarm go off, and I was like, oh, what is this? Look at all these Jeeps and what's happening. So I wander in there, and it's an illegal club called Tires, and I can kind of recognize the techno, and I'm like, that is Juan Atkins. He is playing in an abandoned tire factory. And so this night when I went, they were projecting the Michigan primary over the DJ booth, and they had Shigeto, Derek May, Juan Atkins, DJing until 4 a.m. And that's a Tuesday in Detroit. I was like, that's crazy, you know, because these guys will literally fly to Europe and play a festival, and they'll talk. Like, I was the only black person at this festival, 300,000 kids, and then they come back to Detroit. And they still play this illegal club. And so they were really excited because I think Bernie won. And so they were getting very excited. But everyone was watching this. And this is Shigeto. He's an amazing young DJ. And that was just, you know, no cover, very loud. And this is so loud. And I'm like, police have to know. But there isn't enough police to really kind of tackle this because there's some bigger issues, I think, going on. And then there's things like underground resistance. This is running Submerge, where they won't sell you a record. It's another techno label. They won't sell you a record unless they think you're worthy of having that record. And so you'll see kids from Frankfurt and Berlin walking around looking for Submerge, and they're trying to find it because it's not labeled. And the address isn't on there, and so you can tell. I'm like, are you looking for Submerge? And they're like, yes. I'm like, it's over there and down there. And then it's just like a regular record store. So once you get there and you flew from Frankfurt, they're happy to see you. But if you just send an email like, I'm looking for this or for that, they don't even respond. These are people who have a lot of integrity, and they really just don't care if you want the record or not. This is the inside of it. So once you get there, it looks kind of like a regular record store in the basement, but impossible to find. I mean, just impossible to find. And then it's all records, so that's the other thing. People always ask for CDs or something, and I don't even know what would happen if you asked for a CD. But that's Cornelius Harris. He's the one that runs the record label, manages all the talent. This is a book that our board member, Julie Taubman, did. It's called 138 Square Miles of Detroit. It was published in 2014. It's a very, very thick book, and it's just photographs of Detroit. A lot of the buildings have been torn down that she has in the book. Some of them are live, but it's just this picture book. And then it has this amazing architectural key about if the building is still surviving and who the architect was. And so this is something that you'll see. This is the Michigan Theater. This is across the street from Comerica Park, which is where the Tigers play. And they park cars in there during the games. And this is also where I think Nick Cave, when he did his Detroit project, he did a big sound suit photo shoot there. But it's just amazing to see that kind of architecture. And now it's a parking lot. This is Kate. She runs an urban farm that's completely illegal called Burnside Farms. It's just on the west and south side.
Why would a farm be?
She probably doesn't own the land. She probably just saw some abandoned strips, some abandoned houses, and moved in. And so that's where it gets very difficult because that's a very positive force for the community. However, it is not participating in the traditional forms of ownership, i.e. taxes. And she's so cute. How could, my God, like that's a very positive, and she's growing all this food. She's giving it away. Restaurants are now buying all her herbs. I mean,
Couldn't she buy the land for
if she knew who owned it. So that's the other part that has to get figured out. They don't always know. This is Write a House. This is another not-for-profit that's doing amazing work. They go around, they buy a house that's valued $10,000 and less. They work with Habitat for Humanity. They fix it up, and then they select out of their board a writer to give it to. So then the writer comes to Detroit. They have a house to live in, and it's theirs. And I think they pay the taxes and the utilities for the first 2 years, but it's their house. And then there's lots of engagement that happens around that writer, and sometimes they do a lot of readings, and it just sort of like they really become part of Detroit. And then there's cool things like The Dream Is Now. This is the People's Press. This is something that's happening through Powerhouse Productions. They're starting their own press. This is a show that we have up at MoCAD right now. It's Icelandic performance artist Ragnar Hartjensen, and this is a woman in E. So we have every time the museum is open, we have a guitarist play the key of E minor, and they work. We have about 7 to 9 performers, and they work about 2 to 3 hour shifts. And there's a gold and white guitar. They wear a gold dress. They stand. They sit, and the stage rotates because it's a former auto showroom, and he had this idea that the cars were kind of rotating. And there's been a lot of discussion around objectification of women and what is a fetish. So I think it's providing some really good discussion, and at the same time you'll hear some of the women performers say, I'm just meditating, I'm working, I'm a badass performer, this is awesome. So there's a lot of different discussions happening. This is just kind of going back, this is kind of the front of MoCAD, another sort of facade, and this is an installation of Martin Creed, and it was neon lights, everything is going to be all right, and it's over a Barry McGee mural. And so when I got there 3 years ago, this was on there, and I asked Barry McGee if we could, because we were getting cited for graffiti, because it was so faded. And so I said, well, maybe we can repaint it. And so I asked Barry if we could just go over the lines and freshen it up. And that's when he said, no, absolutely not. You can't. It's graffiti. Paint over it. And so that's when we had the idea to keep going with this facade wall. That's just a little bit of what
So you brought in Martin Creed at that point?
We had Martin Creed, yeah, and so we did that. And that was something that we own, and so he first did it around our opening, Barry McGee, and so then we had Martin Creed, and it's something we own, so we can bring it back, whenever we want, which is really exciting. So I'm like, if you don't have something that's super precious, you can paint on it, you can hang on it, you can do all kinds of things, which I think is like really freeing. And maybe if our building, if it goes back to like the historic preservation code, then maybe we'll have different types of discussions. But right now it has this Italian restaurant facade, and I'm like, it doesn't matter, just layer it on. We'll figure it out later. So it's been kind of freeing. And then also you get to see, in this picture, you get to see what MoCAD and Woodward Avenue looks like pre-M1. So M1 is the light rail that's happening. So you can kind of see what it looks like at night. And you can see it looks pretty dark. Not a lot of street lights, and that's a main thoroughfare. I think that's my last slide too. So that's all we got. And I'm happy to take questions too, if you guys have questions about MoCAD or Detroit or any of the projects that I showed.
So is it really just the art world, the Wild Wild West?
Sometimes, but not always. I would say pre-bankruptcy, it felt very wild. And now it's slowly being more formalized. It's kind of like when I read about, I was just saying this, like I just read that Carnival Cruises is building docks so they can do the cruises to Cuba. And I was like, so Cuba and Havana was like a tropical Detroit, and I'm so glad I went and took my board there. Went a year and a half ago, because it's going to change, and I feel like that change is happening in Detroit. However, it's happening in pockets. So it's 138 square miles. Boston, Manhattan, and San Francisco can fit within the city limit. So it's 3 cities within the city limit. So can't support all of that. And so what they're trying to do is de-accession land and not have it be part of the city of Detroit. So that's a very interesting legal thing to go through. Like, how do you de-accession? Like, how do you return land to prairie, but then how do you de-accession it so it's not part of your city?
Is there any precedent for that?
No, but Detroit was also the first city to declare bankruptcy, so there really wasn't, and that was all, yeah, big, so there wasn't any big law, that was new law as well. So I think that's going to struggle for a little while, and I think it's going to become a city of villages, meaning that like Corktown, Midtown, Downtown, Eastern Market, these will be the sort of pockets that have density, and then there'll be less in between.
Well, how does everybody deal with the crippling taxes?
They're high. So I live in Detroit, and you have your property taxes, which are really high, and then the city of Detroit, it's so crazy. They do you another tax, another income tax. So I pay another $8,000 in income tax, and Scott has to pay the same thing. So that's a lot. That's a lot of outgoing money.
It's having a car.
Oh yeah. So that's the other part, is that the car insurance, I think that they get a lot of census data from car insurance. So there's no way and Scott, we can't afford to insure our cars with our City of Detroit address. So we have to say like we have a different garage address. So that's gonna, it's not just one problem in Detroit, there's several problems coming into play. Quicken is a big sort of company, and there's several other companies that they pay your City to Detroit tax for you. So there's several programs, a small not-for-profit's not involved in them, but there's several programs that will help you pay your tax to the city. But there needs to be more people to support that, because it's really high. To pay $700-800 in car insurance per year, who's gonna have car insurance? When you hear those numbers, you're like, of course you don't have car insurance. If you don't have like a parent that lives in East Lansing or a board member, they'll say, sure, you're gonna be out of luck,
What do people do for schools?
For schools, that's very interesting. We have a really good teen program, and so I know about the high schools. I don't know so much about the younger schools, but I think they struggle. There was a Friends Quaker school that was semi-private that just recently closed because of funding. I think a lot of people go to Girls Point and send their kids to Catholic schools. And it's tough because you have these techno guys, they live in downtown Detroit. If they're sending their kids to a Catholic school in Girls Point, something is up. That's like the biggest red flag, because they're so, you could live in Barcelona and have a much shorter commute to these festivals, and they're like, no, we live in Detroit, it's what we gotta do. But they're sending their kids to Catholic schools in Girls Point, because it's the closest. It's right up Jefferson. You can get there in 12 to 18 minutes. Yes.
I was really intrigued. I enjoyed the really neutral way that you presented all the different things happening in the city. And I was wondering about how you facilitate the various competing kind of interests or contingencies that, it's my sense, are kind of struggling in Detroit, or I don't know,
There's two more projects that come to mind, and one of them is Katie Newell's project. She's U of M is deeply engaged in Detroit, and Katie Newell's studied architecture at Cranbrook, has an experimental MFA program, and she teaches at U of M. And so what she did, Detroit has a lot of arson. You probably have heard about arson stories. And so she found a site that had an important bungalow house that was burnt down. She went around Detroit and collected all this arson wood and then reconstructed this house, almost to look exactly like its original form, but it was made out of arson wood. And it was probably up for about a good 2 or 3 weeks, and then the High Museum got wind of it. They came and they bought it and they took it. So I don't know. And then it was kind of an amazing project for that neighborhood to go through, because they got to talk about what arson does to a neighborhood and articulate who lived there, what happened, the houses next to it. And so they found it really healing, the immediate neighbors. And they actually didn't want that structure to be there. It was made out of arson wood. It was incredibly sad for them. So they took it as a moment of healing. Then there's Mitch McEwen. She's another U of M faculty, and she bought a house in Southwest. It's a Latino-Mexican neighborhood, and she wrapped it in Tyvek, which is that sort of moisture barrier material. But when she did it, she took all the black and white and made it a geometric design. Then the front of it, she titled it House Opera, Opera House. The front of it pulled down, because you can do these kinds of things as no one's watching and there's no code really being enforced. And she did opera performances, and for the whole neighborhood.
I didn't phrase my question well. I wasn't trying to put you on the defensive about like whether or not the art is valid. I was actually trying to understand like what's possible. I don't think it's possible to sort of ignore that this is a city that has been neglected to the point of total death and failure, and that creates a lot of opportunities for creative people with limited resources, and those people are taking advantage of those opportunities. I just feel like that's a given, and I'm without judgment. I'm fascinated by what that can produce in terms of conversations or visions or alternatives or new systems or new institutions. So I guess the question wasn't so much about this is. I'm not trying to get you to defend the work. I'm actually much more interested in your position there and being in an institution that's trying to facilitate all this. Is like, how do you deal with that kind of tension and what is possible?
I would say anything is possible. I mean, when you have like what we have in Detroit, and I think those are really strong. The reason why I bring those up is that those are really successful interventions, because there's a lot of non-successful interventions that happen too. But those are standout ones that have really worked and continue to work in the community, and they're beloved. And when you have so much despair and so much blight, sort of these pockets and bright spots really sing really loudly, and they're signs of hope and connecting, and that's really important. And I would say as MOCAD, we're in the center of everything. We're probably the most community-driven museum that I know of. Roberta Smith came to town and was like, you are running the most progressive institution in the United States, and I wholeheartedly agree. We have like the largest, I mean, we ask the community all the time, what do we want? What do you want? How are we going to do this? We have the largest AA meeting on every Sunday night on the state of Michigan. I've never been to an art museum. I've worked at a lot of art museums in my career. I don't think we've ever had an AA meeting. I mean, I can't see the MCA. I love the MCA. I can't see them holding an AA meeting every single week. It's 86 people and 90 people. And the thing that I really, yeah, and the thing I love about it is they sit in a circle and they're staring at the art. So they know the art sometimes better than, I'm sorry to say, our visitor services people do, because they actually stare and they read the labels. I mean, because they come every single week. There's also yoga at 6, so you can do yoga and then you can hit your AA meeting. We have an incredible teen council. All of our teens are graduating, and they're not just going to like Grand Valley, but they're going to Yale, they're going to Vassar, they're going to U of M. I mean, these are bright kids that when I first get a hold of them, they're like, I don't even need to go to college, there are no jobs. And I have parents say like, I don't know, my kid, they're okay, but I don't want them to leave home, so don't take them away from me. And I also have parents say, like, my kid didn't get into teen council. What's up with that? You crushed their dreams. And like, when I first moved there was no grocery store. And you can go to Eastern Market and buy like bushels of kale or a wheel of cheese, or you have to drive 30 minutes to go to a grocery store. And everyone's like, Whole Foods, whole paycheck. Everyone goes there. They're like, we built it too small. We can't build a second one fast enough. So it's not the kind of gentrification that's happening in the Lower East Side. This is blight. Nothing existed except for abandonment. So I would say it's a different type of gentrification. There are pockets around the new hockey stadium that are gentrification, and people are getting pushed out there because they have to make way for the hockey stadium, and that's a whole different conversation. But it's 3 cities in one city. There's so much space and so much land where these interventions are needed. And I like it because Cranbrook has this whole graduating class. They use the city as like kind of like their laboratory, and then they leave. And I'm actually, it's okay. I'm okay with it because it's amazing experiments that are happening. And if it's just there for a little bit, that's fine. I mean, I think you have to do that kind of radical practice in order to get outside the gallery.
So I guess just to clarify, you're saying that there aren't actually residents being put upon by the art projects because everything's empty?
No, I think it's a matter of proximity, I would say, for sure. I mean, like the charcoal house, for sure. I mean, that's very much embedded that was very much embedded in Corktown, a very densely, but it had like a street of arson. And it's not like they have money to come and clean up the arson and like raise it. The arson sits there for years. And I think that's the difference. That when I was working in Raleigh and I'd fly to Detroit, and I'll go back to Raleigh and I'd fly to Detroit, Raleigh started looking like a plastic city. And I'm like, this is all figured out, was all built in the last 5 years. Detroit is a very old city. And yeah, you can do a lot because Dobbles, he started because no one was really looking. No one was paying. He's like, I did this because no one was paying attention. And he's like, it's what I wanted to do. I mean, he's like an independent sort of visionary. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems like so much of what's happening in Detroit in terms of art is like social practice and students outside of the community. And I'm just like wondering about kind of studio practice artists in Detroit and how they can sustain their
Yeah. Well.
the gallery scene, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's a really important studio artist named Hernan Boss that's been living there since 2004, I believe. Hernan Boss, he shows with Lehman Melpin in New York. His partner's from Detroit. He does a Miami, Detroit thing because he's from Miami. And they just bought a beautiful Art Deco building, and they're putting in boatloads of money to fix it up so they can have a live-work situation there. And because of him, we have curators in Lehman Melpin come to town all the time. And then we have Nancy Michnick, and we have the Cass Corridor artists that are largely forgotten, but they're studio-based artists. And we're doing a show with Nancy Michnick, and now like Marlborough Gallery is starting to look at her, so they're starting to come. The Whitney, of course, Christopher Liu is coming to town for the Whitney. And so there's an amazing amount of curators that come through town. I'm surprised, but they're there just to check things out. And the music scene is pretty vibrant too, so you can get like a really full day, which I think is important. But yeah, there's all types. I mean, you can be an artist that just does their own thing and just doesn't really participate in the conversation, or you can be an artist that heavily participates in the conversation, and you help people with their project and they will turn out to help you with your project. I think it just depends on what kind of practice you have, but there's some amazing galleries. The Suzanne Hilberry Gallery is still going strong. She gifted it to her directors, and she named our senior curator, so she's very much part of Detroit. And then there's lots like Wasserman just moved downtown, David Klein just moved downtown, Johnson and Trading Just bought a big church, and it's not Oh Wow anymore from LA, but I think it's Moran and Bondernoff. They just renamed their gallery. They're running that space for 3 years, and it's beautiful. It's an old, church that was built in 1879, and they're completely redoing it with a gallery space. And then you have artists like Chris Schenk, who participates in all the art fairs and makes foil furniture and employs, as far as I can tell, half of Hamtramck making his furniture. So I guess it just depends on, like, my husband is a studio artist, and, he kind of just goes to the studio every day. And he could go to the studio here, or he can go to the studio there. It just depends on where he goes. He's got a lot more square feet in Detroit, but that's the only difference, really. And I guess he can afford, the difference is that it's so much cheaper, so he has 4 studio assistants versus 1, and, so that changes things.
Well, I'm curious, kind of to the point of many curators visiting Detroit and coming to understand what's happening there. I worked for you forever ago at MCA.
Now remember.
And I'm curious if there's anything, so much of what you described is specific to Detroit circumstances. Like, what can a museum like the MCA, and not to pick on them, but like, or the Milwaukee Art Museum, like, what do you think they can learn from your institution?
Well, I guess I got fed up and I left. I didn't like working there anymore. I've worked for really big institutions, and I don't see myself going back to that big institution. I think they're completely disconnected from the community. I don't see, you have to go out. You have to go to the openings, and you have to see everything. Part of our staff assignments is who is going to what, and they have to report back. Hey, I went to this thing. It was here. I ran into this person, and I always hear your staff is everywhere. They're checking everything out. I never saw that in Chicago, and it was really disappointing. And I certainly didn't see it in Milwaukee. I just feel really disconnected, and I don't mean to pick on these institutions. They do fabulous shows and big research, amazing scholarship. I just feel like they're really disconnected to what their community is doing, and they don't have a connection. That's one of the things. It's when we have a book in our bookstore, we don't just put the book in the bookstore, but we do, all right, so you're gonna write a book called Beautiful Ruins. Let's get you in here, Dora. Let's do the talk. Let's have amazing Q&A. Let's connect. And that talk got 150 people, and she sold out all her books. So I think it's good for her, but she also has to explain, what's the title about? Beautiful, Terrible Ruins, because that's the crux of Detroit. They're beautiful and they're terrible. And so I would say I left the Milwaukee Art Museum to go to the Art Institute, and that's when I was I'm going to finish my MBA, and I'm going to figure out how to run an institution that's completely connected to the community. And we have a show series called Detroit City, and it has 3 parts: Detroit Stages, Detroit Speaks, and Detroit Affinities. Because I was listening to all the Detroit artists, and they're we just want a show, but I don't know any artists. There's artists in New York, right? Do they ever come? I'm oh my gosh, you have to have a network. So what we do with Detroit Affinities, it's this kind of wild exchange. So we pick a Detroit artist, they do their solo show. We say, hey, is there an artist out there that you would want to meet and work with? And so one person picked Jamie and Volano. So I was great, we're gonna get her. So Jamie actually did her first museum show at MoCAD. Now it's at the Whitney. But this person was I really want to meet Jamie, and I think her paintings are wild. And I'm all right, cool, let's do it. So Jamie comes to town, they do these structured studio visits, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, well, Jens, he's our senior curator at large, he does work at the Jewish Museum. All of a sudden, these Detroit artists are popping up at the Jewish Museum. If you look, every show he does, Unorthodox has 10 Detroit artists in there. That's crazy. It's only because we're making sure these artists get out into the world, because some artists don't want that. I can think of 5 where I'm they should be out there, but they just don't want it. But some people do. So we try to create these avenues for them. But I don't know another museum that's gone to an artist and said, is there another artist you want to work with? Never. I've never. If there is another program like that, I want to know about it. Oh, you had a question.
if there's any conflicts or not, but in a similar way that your institution has adapted and, you know, kind of really defined the model of the institution, can you just talk about, is this happening in like your art schools or art programs?
No, I think if we had a better art school, I think Detroit would be a better art city. Sometimes CCS picks on me and I say, hey, if you had a better art program, this would be a better art city. So
So the art programs aren't really responding.
you can always, no, I mean, CCS has got a fashion program. That was their big change. I don't know. I mean, U of M, if you graduate from the business school, which sometimes I teach strategic planning at the business school, I mean, MOCAD is running $1.5 million. It is a small house of cards budget. We have 5 full-time people. Like, I was surprised that the Ragnar show is going to travel to the Hirshhorn. I was like, you're actually going to pay for this whole show now, Hirshhorn. I mean, it is a house of cards. So we all have teaching jobs, Tylons, that we all go out and teach still. And sometimes I teach in the MBA program at U of M. And if you graduate from there and you start a business in Detroit, they give you $50,000 cash to start, as long as your business plan was approved by the dean.
You about this?
Yeah, I know. It is sweet, right? So I'm like, nail salon, car wash, right now, please do it. I mean, like, that's the other thing is, like, it's difficult to live in Detroit. Like, you have to drive to the burbs to get your car wash. You can go to some gas stations, but not all. There's no place to get your nails done, which I think is insane. You have to go to Royal Oak to get your hair cut. I mean, these are basic. If you're a guy, you're set. But, you know, I mean, it's still, like, crazy to me. It's crazy. When I first got there, I live in a Mies van der Rohe complex, and it's the highest concentration of Mies van der Rohe design buildings anywhere on the planet is in Detroit. And when I first got there, someone drove through the plate glass to get to the pharmacy, and they robbed it. And I was like, okay. That was the one grocery store that I would go to, and it's closed now. And they had to bar it all up, and it looks terrible. So, I mean, but, it's just thin. It's thin, like the resources are so thin, and I keep saying it's because it's so much to manage, MOCAD does great stuff because it's 25,000 square feet. We do 7 shows a year, It's amazing. Like, I stopped going to see music, but I go out. So I'm like, oh my gosh, this Iggy Pop is going to play at our museum soon. Kraftwerk played with Derek May, like, over the summer. You stay in a hotel, like the Westin, and you drive around, you see Heidelberg, you go meet Dobbles. And the thing is that you just can walk in and Dobbles is there, and you get to meet Tyree. I mean, like, that's amazing. You can go to Astro Coffee and, like, Juan Atkins will be there. I mean, he's one of the inventors of techno, And they're so excited. They're like, oh, what brings you to I mean, it's a really friendly place. Like, if there's a new face, they're like, hi! So...
Interesting because it seems to, like, the city is become part of the tourist economy that's more similar to, not like a typical American city, but more like where you go to, say, you might go to Bali, you might go to,
Mm-hmm.
San
Yeah.
all of this, culture. And at some point, I mean, it takes a while.
Sure.
But it takes,
That's the Cuban cruise boat problem. I think it's coming.
Are the visitors supporting the culture, and is the culture changing or sustaining?
Sure, it's going to change. It has to.
To support the tourists?
I don't think so. I think it's like even the train station got all all new windows put in because the mayor wanted to, like, throw around some power and muscle, and so it got windows. It's like, great. We've ruined one of the icons, I mean, there still is a part of me that kind of likes the craziness, but then I've also been on I-75, and I've seen like crazy drag racing. You know, like you just see crazy stuff sometimes. I've seen a house in winter, and for some reason the water pipe burst, and like it was like a waterfall outside the front window, and it was just gushing. It filled up with water, and it came out and it froze. So there's wild scenes like that where you're like, we're not going to see that anymore because the city went and shut off all the water on a lot of abandoned properties. So they got a little organized there.
Artists are able or thinking about or trying to sort of like take some of their alternative workaround ways of inhabiting the space and the property and trying to engage the city about formalizing those in some way, or is it much more liberating to just stay the way they are and to avoid
Well,
formal engagements?
knowing what I know about the city, I don't know why you would want to engage the city right now. It's post bankruptcy. So when I got to MoCA, we had a temporary occupancy permit for 8 years. This was the last 3 months. We were on 8 years of it. I mean, because there was just no one that you could go to. I went and got a liquor license, and I tried to go through the city. And finally, I just went to a private owner, and I put it on my credit card. I'm like, this will be easier. I don't know if you can get, like, you have a very organized, well-run city here. I don't think that you can get outside that framework until you go and you're like at the city hall, and they're like, go down the hall. So you go down the hall, and the person's like, we do dog licenses here, and we're not giving those out because we don't have a computer. I've gone to see city officials, and they're like, you know what, let's just look it up on our phone because these computers don't work anymore. Hopefully some of that city, sort of department will get better and get caught up. My husband bought a building, and he's still trying to register it with the city. Like, they're like, come back. And so, like, he can't, like, you would try to pay your taxes, and for some reason they can't find it. And it is like a lot of city sort of lots that have been sort of put under one ownership, and it was many. But they're like, keep that paperwork. Don't give it to us, because we'll lose it.
It's such an amazing opportunity for the city itself to
Well, it just got a mayor. It was under, emergency manager, and that was really about paying off the debt. So basically, when they didn't have money to pay off their debt, so they had to use, the DIA collection. Let's look there. Well, that didn't work out. We have actual land. So a Chinese credit holder took Joe Louis in part of the lakefront. That's what they got, a credit land swap, because that's what they had to do. So the emergency manager had to figure out that part, because all these creditors were about to take the city. So that was a big deal. So the mayor has only been in office for less than a year. It's going to take a second to reorganize and right-size your departments, because the city government still had enough people working as if it had 1.5 million residents, not 600,000. It's going to take a second. And then, of course, you have just police cars. There's no police cars, so that's why you didn't see any police. So you have someone like Dan Gilbert. Okay, I'll give you $1 million, but you have to buy the police cars. You have to spend it on police cars. And that wasn't enough. It's kind of like a Sim City, I call it. So he's got downtown, the Illiges have midtown. He literally pays for all the street sanitation and all the private security. It is all privatized. And so when I say Sim City, I'm like, he's literally building downtown. And so it's going to, and the mayor's like, all right, so you have downtown, you have midtown. I'm going to go focus on Corktown and the universities and sort of threading together this blighted area. And then you'll see kind of wackadoodle things where you'll be in the middle of nowhere and it's all blight, but yet they have new handicap curb cutouts. And you're like, how did that get here? And they're like, well, that's federal.
It's lawsuits.
Yeah, it's lawsuits and it's federal. So then you're like, no one lives here. This wasn't necessary. And how did you spend that money? So you start to see really key mismanagement, and it's pretty out in the open. But then it's awesome because it's like, do you want to buy a public library? It's for sale, and all the content's for $16,000. You know? And so like that's amazing. I did a dinner, a fundraiser at a school, and it looked like all of the contents were just barfed out on the front parking lot. And I picked something up, and I'm like, oh my God, this is someone's medical record. They got a measles shot. Oh my God, look real close. It's a social security number. Oh my God, it's all over the parking lot. So I don't know, like, if you can really imagine, like, sort of like the disorganization, you know? And every day it gets better, and it gets, people move in, you know, an artist came from, because they're at the dinner, and they're like, I'm gonna take all this stuff, this is cool. And I'm like, okay, there's social security numbers. I guess you can take it. I'm not gonna tell you can't. It just gets interesting really fast. Like, can they take it? Is that ethical? Should they dispose of it, you know? Probably, but will they? I don't know. Is it their job? I don't know. So it's a lot of that. And then there's also this other kind of like weird fact, is that like in 1994, if you were working for the city, so like fire, police, school teachers, you no longer had to live in the city limits. So that whole layer of middle class like moved out in 94. So that was another sort of wave of exodus that happened. It's a very interesting place, I think, and I think it's a really creative place. I'm all for it. I like it. I've grown accustomed to it. But every day it's, you know, you see something new. When I first got there, there was like this man walking just naked on Woodward, and during rush hour I was driving at work. And he was just naked, he's walking, you know? And I was like, I wonder if that's the energy people are talking about, like just, you know? And I just, you know, like it's, you see a lot of like, I've seen more stuff there in this like 3 years that I've just been like, wow, what an enormous scale of just craziness. But then that's really beautiful because you see like young people move there, and they're like, I'm gonna have the Bahamas by Neil, and I'm gonna have a gallery, and I'm gonna have like international artists. And this guy is like 24, and he's gonna do Basel. Like, he got into Basel. I'm like, that's amazing. That's so good. And that's what he wants to do. Like, he is that guy that wants to go to Basel. Not everyone wants to go to Basel, but he definitely did, and he got in. So I'm like, that's awesome. It's the Bahamas by Neil. Sean Blott. I mean, he's just this crazy kid. He's 24, maybe he's 26, but he's very young. He did his first show, he applied, and he got in. And it mostly exists on the internet, you know, he's only done one show. That poor guy was like sanding his walls for like a year before he would open his show because he wanted like level 5 finish, you know? So he was chasing it. There's a lot of chasers. And the other thing you have to realize about Detroit is the same reason a misfit moved there, there's other misfits that are also moving there. So people will get like, oh, it's too crowded here, it's too, you know, gentrifying. Like, these people moved here for the exact same reason you did too. So you have to give people a little bit of a break. Anything else? Great. Well, thanks for coming.